Hey, what's up guys? It's your boy Daze, and you're about to watch Thorin rant for about 3 hours.
You minor, we major, you all up in the game and don't deserve to be a player, as Mob Deep infamously said, and actually I said, repeating their words as an homage, during the Gambit versus Renegades train game at the MLG Columbus offline qualifier. So obviously you, whoever you are listening to this video, are very much minor in esports. You really don't matter. I'm major, done many of them, you know. Yeah, I'm going to give this one a little bit of a wide berth, but in general, doing a lot of majors, you know, and, you know, the gap between us never really will be bridged. But even plebs like you can learn from major champions like Fallen, Shocks, current major champions, Astralis actually just came on board, by going to Boomio, where they have guides, and you can practice the same way Astralis and the videos are practicing with the Prefire and the duels mods, and you can try it out for free, and it's a good service. Now, CSGO's qualification system for the majors is pretty straightforward. It's one of the things I like about it. It's very stratified. So what we do is we start with the last major, and the teams that make the top 8, the legends, they stay there and they wait until the next major. Now, the bottom 8 teams at that major go down into the offline qualifier, and they wait for that next offline qualifier, which is what's taking place right now. Then the bottom 8 teams at the last offline qualifier drop out, and they go down to the minors. The minors, teams qualify for in an open system, as in they have to drop down and qualify themselves now because we had an open system, we didn't have invites anymore. And it's open and they have a closed aspect, but in general, anyone in theory who's good enough could qualify for the minors. We have 4 minors. We have the Americas, which is obviously North and South. We have EU, technically Europe, but I mean, they're almost counting it like the EU because they've diversified by having CIS, which is obviously the former Soviet countries in general, and then they have Asia. So those are the 4 that we have overall. Now, the big issue at the moment is that of the 4, the most obviously useless is CIS. Now, there's a caveat to that, which is that I would still say, in general, that actually Asia is the most useless. Only it isn't, because the best teams from Asia have to go ahead and use the Asian minor every time to get back through to be able to play at the offline qualifier, because they don't make it to the majors. Like Renegades doesn't make it to the majors now. Tyloo doesn't make it to the majors now. So as a result, their minor ends up looking better than the CIS minor overall, even though I would still say CS has more potential to produce top teams. Plus, the fact that Asia is so far away and it's so difficult to get those teams competing, and obviously there is no option to have them complete an online qualifier rather, to go into like what would be a minor that would cover EU. That just wouldn't work in terms of ping, and so it would be unfair. In that sense, the Asian minor can at least justify its existence. But the problem the CIS minor has is that first and foremost, you have to put it in the context of why it's been so bad the last couple of majors. So first of all, it is true that if every team from every region had to come through the minor system, CIS would be a very prominent minor and would absolutely be justified. The problem they have at the moment is that the region isn't weak as a whole. It's that all the top teams are already qualified and don't ever need to go through the minor at the moment. I mean, Na'Vi, Gambit, and Flipside are the big names from the CIS region. All 3 of them are already beyond the major part of the system. Flipside's waiting in the offline qualifier. Na'Vi and Gambit are legends, so they're waiting in the next minor. In fact, what set off this problem with the CIS minor is that very early on in the minor system, because it started in 2016, we got all 3 of the top teams from the CIS region straight into the Legends spots, because at ESL 1 Cologne, all 3 of those teams, Na'Vi, Gambit, Flipside, all finished top 8 at ESL 1 Cologne 2016. So there's also the factor that Hellraisers used to be a team in the mix for CIS and used to be a squad that you'd have to look out for there. So suddenly there was 4 potentially good teams from there, and obviously only 2 teams can come out the minor slot. But Hellraisers has changed it up, and at the moment have a team that's only 2 out of the 5 from CIS, and thus in the last 2 main minors they competed in the European minor, and both times qualified from the European minor into the offline qualifier. And obviously they don't need to qualify this time because they were in the major itself, so they're already waiting in the offline qualifier. So in that world where any of these teams drop down, or where Hellraisers adds another CIS player, yeah, we would need the CIS money. It would have its own kind of benefit and it would justify its existence. The problem is the current crop of teams that come through, while the better teams are above in the system, which obviously the system can't always account for, they actually aren't even vaguely good enough. Like Vega Squadron, Tengri, the Team Spirit at the last one, even though Team Spirit admittedly had the manager playing. These teams were never going to qualify for the major. And so part of the issue here is it then ends up looking unfair that the CIS, even with all their best teams already through, still gets 2 spots for the offline qualifier. Whereas you go and you look over in the EU, and there are absolutely EU teams who are much better than the teams that qualified from the CIS minor. Never mind any of the other teams that might be below them. So Dignitas, the team that at the moment looks like they have an okay chance to potentially qualify for the minor, they would not have been at the offline qualifier under normal rules. The only reason they were there is because there was 3 spots for the EU minor this time, because when the French shuffle happened and those Envious players, 3 of them, went over to G2, they took Envious's spot for the offline qualifier, and Envious took in some G2 players but didn't have a core of 3 that played in G2 at the major, and so they lost their spot, and that spot went down to the minor. So under normal rules, Dignitas wouldn't even be there, and yet Tengri would, and yet Dignitas is a significantly better team than Tengri, for example. So the problem here is it's not as simple as saying, right, just scrap the CIS minor, just have it all be Europe and have more teams come from Europe, and if they're good enough, they'll come through, they'll qualify for the European qualifier, a minor rather, and go there and they'll make it, and we'll have, we'll have like 4 or we'll have 5 slots from Europe. It's not as simple as that, because if any of those top CIS squads don't do as well at majors and major qualifiers next time and still have good players, we'll have good teams there, but there won't be a minor for them to play in. So it might be more difficult in that sense. And obviously, yes, CIS teams have a ping problem playing with some of the Western European teams. So in that sense, even logistically, separating the minors does make sense to a degree. Then there's another question, which is, let's go the other way. What if we make more minors? Is that an approach? I mean, making the CIS minor has its own merit to it, right? As I've outlined here, even if at the moment it's its weakest, but there's a lot of chances in the future it can be much stronger. So I would say right away, a minor that if the CIS region can justify having one, I would say you can justify having a Nordic minor. I specifically say Nordic, not Scandinavian, because of how you actually divide it up, where Nordic includes Finland as well. So Nordic would have Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and they'd have their own little minor. Now, that might initially sound like, but why do we need that? Why not have the EU? Because actually, the Nordic region itself has more reason to have a minor than any other reason, any other one of these smaller areas. It has been historically the best region in the history of Counter-Strike for top teams, winning majors, all the rest of it. In CSGO even, it has overwhelmingly produced the most top teams of any particular smaller region in that sense. There's tons of up-and-coming talent. I mean, remember, think of some of the teams that didn't make it to the EU minor that come from the Nordic region. I mean, let's just go to Denmark alone. We had Heroic, we had Tricked, we had Singularity. All these teams have done decent to big things at smaller lands recently. In the case of Heroic, obviously, when they had Valde, they finished top 4 IEM Katowice, a huge tournament. There's also the precedent from other esports games that even if one area is part of a bigger area, if it significantly produces better players and teams, to give it its own regional qualification. So in League of Legends, StarCraft 2 and Dota, they have regions which are just a country even. So in StarCraft 2 and League of Legends, Koreans are the absolute best. They're overwhelmingly the best country. And so they have their own entire region to qualify for things like WCS. Whereas like Europe, or now it's Europe and NA combined together because there's not much of a scene there. But they used to have their own entire things for all of NA and all of EU, or rather Americas and EU. Then you go and look in Dota. Obviously, the Koreans aren't as prevalent, but it's China that historically has been the powerhouse country. And so China has its own qualifier in that sense for the international and the majors, etc. Now, going beyond the Nordic region, I think you could make a good case for making. What about having a South American minor? Make the Americas minor into the NA minor and have a South American minor. Because SK Gaming, formerly Luminosity, one of the best teams in the world, absolutely fantastically good. But if they got even a little bit less good, if they were even a little bit worse, maybe there's a world in which they might have to play in a minor. And so now if they had their own minor, it makes it not as difficult for NA teams, and it gives them their own area to play from. I mean, if there was a world in which Immortals and SK played in the minor for South America, then suddenly that's as easily better than the Asia minor, and yet the Asia minor exists. There's also the fact that people, again, are taking for granted that you just don't need a South American minor at the moment. SK Gaming is one of the best teams, so they're always at the major. Immortals, I mean, admittedly, they never made the major, but they're always good enough to make it through the Americas minor, and they always have done. So it's never been necessary to have something below that or separate. And obviously beyond that, yes, I agree. The other teams, the Luminosities of the world, etc., have not shown themselves to be good enough when they've competed at any kind of context. So yeah, they haven't needed their own minor. But again, is that what we're doing it for? I mean, the Asian minor, part of why that exists is because it's so far away as a region, it has ping disadvantage. Well, what for the Americas minor? Do South American teams not have ping disadvantage playing in the Americas minor? I mean, I'd go ahead and say they do. There's no real way to bridge the gap between someone playing from like Brazil or Peru or Argentina with someone playing at the, let's say, from Toronto. There's no real way to make a fair ping between those teams that's reasonable in contrast to the other minors and how their online qualifiers are going. Now, I admit, if those two teams qualified tomorrow, if those two teams retired tomorrow, rather, SK Gaming and Immortals, yeah, there would probably never be a team from that minor who'd be able to make it to the major. There might be one who could make it to the qualifier, but it's unreasonable to think at the moment that would be someone who would be making it to the major. So again, we have the problem of, yeah, it can justify its existence and it represents a region, but how much of that goes towards how many we want to see at the offline qualifier? So there's a few simple solutions here, but they all obviously have key pros and cons. So solution one is just leave it as it is. I mean, the good thing about the system we have right now is it's very simple to understand, as I outlined at the beginning. Logistically, it's not that difficult to do, like the amount of money you have to spend, the amount of time that you need to run the qualifiers and the minors, the amount of space that you need, as in you have to have a building where you can run those. If you add in more minors, yeah, we're going to have more places where you take place, the minor, etc. Now, you could certainly find ways around that. Like you could have like Fragbite or something runs the Nordic minor, and then you could have some sort of Brazilian website or runs the South American minor. There's ways around it in that sense. But if you're going to have the current system where it's usually actually people who are involved with the major itself who have to run the minors as well, then it's going to start getting more expensive for them. And yeah, logistically, they have to find somewhere to host it and they have to make time for it all. And at the moment, there's barely enough time for all the minors as there is. So I will say that's one reason as to why you might just keep it as it is. So the problem with how it is at the moment is it's less than ideal, like I said. All the reasons you can give for why an Asian or a CIS minor should exist, while they definitely have pros and cons, make it so that how can you justify a Nordic minor not existing or a South American minor not existing? It's really tough because you can't be fair to everyone in that sense. So solution two is to create these minors, is to fragment the system, make a Nordic minor, make a South American minor. Now, what would be good about that is it would make better offline competition between some of the best teams in the world, because it would mean, for example, the Nordic minor would really be able to collect together like a solid 8 teams from that region and then have them battle out on LAN and then get the top 2 through to the offline qualifier in a way that you might not otherwise. It would ensure that you get some really good Nordic teams at the offline qualifier. I mean, remember, if there'd have only been 2 spots at this offline, at the EU minor, everyone thought Envy and Big were going to be the ones making it. There's no Nordic players in there, and yet we know the Nordic players are very good, but some of them are stuck going through these massive online qualifiers with the likes of Heroic, etc., all got upset by smaller teams, and meanwhile you get a team like iGame, who's a much, much smaller team going there. Well, I'd rather see them play against Heroic, etc., a Nordic minor in such a world where 8 teams could make it. Then you've got to consider option 3, which is that what you do is you take these regions that I've described here and you don't make them minors, but you make them qualifiers which lead into the minor. So this is a tough one. What if instead we took CIS and it didn't have a minor, it just had its own online qualifier which led into the EU minor. And then we took the Nordic region, and rather than just being the open qualifier for all of Europe, they had their own qualifier. And again, a couple of spots qualified for the EU minor. And South America had their own online qualifier that guaranteed, say, 2 or 3 teams went to the Americas minors just from South America. Now, what's good about this one is this is kind of a good compromise. It's still not as great because you're competing online. And obviously, it would cause some issues in theory if those Na'Vi Gambit teams dropped down and had to play in the minor. And I don't like online qualifiers in general, so that's the negative for me, that's the con. But the pro is you'd be adding more spots to the EU minor because you'd take out the CIS ones. So now suddenly EU would have 4 teams that make it overall. And from these 4 teams, in theory, you're going to ensure you have some really good Nordic teams. You're going to ensure you have some CIS squads. And then you're still going to have a minor as it is, and then decide which of those top 4 make it out with a really good format offline. So I feel like even though there's an online component more, which I don't like, it does get a lot more of the teams offline. And then offline they compete, but not in a way like the CIS one where they're not really competing against anyone. So it is a tough one. There is also the fact that it doesn't even always work for the Nordic teams. Because, for example, there were 3 kind of Nordic teams already playing at the EU minor, when you consider that Dignitas has 3 Norwegians. So if there's only 3 there, wouldn't that actually in a way reduce their chances if only 2 teams guaranteed made it through from the Nordic qualifier? Wouldn't actually give them less teams at the EU minor? See, it's a tricky scenario like that because the Nordic region is so good. So in a counterintuitive way, they sometimes don't need to have their own minor, although it would be the best minor in theory if you look at how it would work. Also, there's the factor that if you had the Nordic minor, it would free up more of the Western teams overall. You'd have more teams from Germany or from France. These sorts of countries could qualify and be better overall and have their own aspect at the EU minor. That's also something to think about. So maybe you'd see more talent there in that particular sense. Now, obviously, there is no perfect system. I mean, you see, there was pros and cons to everything I've outlined here. And also, you've got to consider that an element of these minors is it's based on representation as well as having the best regions. So regions can change. That's part of the problem the CIS one has shown you. While the problem is the EU minor isn't really going to change. There will always be fantastic teams that will justify an EU minor, but the CIS minor can get very, very stacked or it can be very, very weak. So how do you do it in that respect? Do you change it between majors and minors? That might be a question to ask. Like, I actually think that might be a possibility. The problem there is then people will say it's open to corruption. But I would say if a commissioner could say, right, we're going to give CIS 1 this time because all their good teams are already through. We're going to give 1 more spot to EU. I think that would actually end up with a better tournament. But then obviously then people will cry about it being unfair if they come from those regions at least. I don't think the majority would. I don't think they would actually. Now, I do think that the system we already have is much better than that system they tried in 2015, where they actually just gave NA their own qualifier that directly got them to the major. It was actually like Team Liquid, I think it was Team Liquid and Cloud9, right? That just automatically got through to the major itself just from an NA qualifier. They didn't have to go to the offline qualifier. What I like at the moment is that at least the minor system feeds into one big offline qualifier. So even if we represent teams, oh, you can be from China and Australia and you can come and you can try and compete for the World Championship. Yeah, but you've got to go to the offline qualifier and only the best teams make it. That's what I like. That's cool. So we're allowing representation, but then we're not saying we're not just going to represent you like when they invited that fucking Indian team to come to ESL1 Cologne I think it was 2014, right? Years and years ago and got their shit kicked in, whereas there was way better teams in Europe would have done better. So it's a good mix at the moment between representation and getting the best teams to the major. And I'm glad we have it so that at least minors are offline. So there's an extra component of offline competition before even the offline qualifier. I think that makes it a lot more fair and gets the better teams through. But you can see there's still a lot of wiggle room on where we can go here. And there is an issue with these minors that some of them are just crap, yet are getting teams through to further positions in the qualification for the major.
Hey guys, this is Stewie from Cloud9.